Hi everyone, thanks so much for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. Before we bring on tonight's guest, if you've had a Dogman encounter and would like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. If you've had a Sasquatch sighting and would like to be a guest on Bigfoot Eyewitness Radio, please go to bigfooteyewitness.com and submit a report. All right, let's bring on tonight's guest. If you listened to episodes 72, 160, and 199, you'll remember tonight's guest, Lisa. Well, since Lisa came on episode 199, she's had several new encounters with dogmen, and that's what she's here to tell us about tonight. Lisa, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Vic.
Oh, you're welcome. Lisa, for the listeners who missed the previous episodes you came on and did, please tell them about yourself.
Well, the first time I came on the show was, I believe, in October of 2015. I am an eyewitness who has had multiple encounters, and until that point, I didn't talk about my encounters with anyone, mostly because I thought that I may have imagined things or that I was crazy, especially my early childhood memories. So I spent a lot of years not talking about this sort of thing, especially because of fear of ridicule. Lisa's an alias, because I try to keep my regular life and this life separate. I had very intense early childhood encounters that included actual physical contact with what we thought was a type 3, up to having encounters with the canine type during childhood around our house, and into the teenage years of having some sightings with friends of mine, and even a few scary encounters around my grandmother's house in Massachusetts, and then up through adulthood, where since I've lived in Tennessee, I've had a handful of sightings in the last 4 years, almost 4 years now. So I went from being an eyewitness to researching, and one of the biggest questions was why so many encounters, which really, really bothered me. It made me feel like there was something wrong with me. But also to asking bigger questions about dogmen, to now where I have my own research organization, which we have mentioned before on the show and we can mention at the end, and also to partnering up with some really phenomenal researchers and just really diving into how can we study what this is, how can we gain, information to help people that are having ongoing encounters, or even just to help people deal with the trauma of seeing these things, because it's pretty intense. I actually got diagnosed with PTSD this last year. Not all dogman related, but I do know that some of it had to do with some of my early childhood encounters, which were extremely traumatizing. But there are a lot of people that are looking for answers, that are hurting and afraid. And now myself and people like my research partner, Rick from Wisconsin, who's also an eyewitness, by the way, we're also trying to find ways to help people that are dealing with this now and understand this phenomenon better. So there you go.
I've told you before and I'll say it again, I'm so glad we have people like you out there helping these eyewitnesses the way you do.
Thank you. That's what we'd like to do. It helps us too. It helps us to be able to kind of come to grips with what else we've experienced as well.
Well, it says everything about your character, the fact that you do it. Since you were on the show last time, you've had several new encounters. These new encounters you've had, though, happened when you were acting as a researcher instead of just as an eyewitness. Does that affect how strongly you were affected by those encounters?
It's still scary. It's not something that you get used to, but at the same time, for me personally, because I've had so many experiences and I've had so many eyewitness encounters, I'm just kind of at the point in my life where it doesn't seem like it's something that's going to stop. There are theories about certain people might be attracting these creatures. And of course that sounds scary, because that sounds almost as if there's something wrong with that person, when in fact it really could just be a certain person's personality. And I've actually talked to other eyewitnesses about this. How are you with regular animals? How are you with people? And a lot of people say that animals, especially canines, seem to really like them and trust them, and that people seem to gravitate towards that person because that person might be empathetic, or they might be compassionate, or they might be kind. And as eerie as that sounds, one of the theories that we're working with right now is whether that's a possibility that some dogmen might be drawn to some people. And it is a very scary thought to wrap your head around. I mean, of course, we can't prove it yet, but if that's a possibility for, like in my case, I may as well see what I can do to just help other people. At the same time, I have to set boundaries. I have to set my own limits. I do not go out and research alone. That's something that I refuse to do, partially because I'm female, and I'm also a small female, and it's not just worrying about dogmen. There could be anything that could happen. There could be some lunatic in the woods, or just some homeless people or just whatever. And it's not a prejudice against homeless people, but it's just not safe for me as a female, I feel, to go wander off into the woods for too long looking for these things. So I don't. I prefer to have somebody with me, or I will stay on a path that is very well used, and I'll see what I can see from there. So for myself, I set boundaries, and it's something that I recommend with other people. I mean, there are some researchers that are very bold and will just go out by themselves and spend all kinds of time doing this. But everybody has their limits, and I think that that's perfectly okay and acceptable.
I've told you before how impressed I am with the level-headed approach you take to all of this. That's really good to see.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. All right, Lisa, you've got quite a few new experiences to share with us tonight, so let's get down to it. Please tell us about them.
Okay. Through the community, I've met some amazing people, also some amazing researchers and like minds. And one individual in particular who has become one of my research partners now is a guy that we'll call Rick from Wisconsin. He and I have just similar views about nature, about animals, about behavior, and he has a lot of experience working with canine working groups. And I have a background in applied behavioral analysis therapy. And we just were talking for a while pretty casually about how you can apply certain things like positive and negative reinforcement. And so we decided that we wanted to see if these things could be applied to dogmen. And the reason why is because we're seeing certain similarity, or even absolutes, if you will, right? Such as many people that have dogmen on their property may also have an abandoned building, such as a barn or an old homestead that burned down or just became no good to live in anymore. A lot of times, dogmen will actually take up residence in those places. So that would be considered positive reinforcement because it's not being used by people, but it's something that they can use to get out of, the elements, just like any other animal, just like any animal would take up residence in an abandoned building. So that was an example, and this is something that we noticed as similarities across the board, that a lot of people will mention who have them on their property that they've seen them in or around abandoned buildings. So then we just started talking a little bit further and seeing if he and I could team up and work together as researchers. And so he came here about a month ago, Thanksgiving weekend, down to Nashville where I live. And he knows about my encounters here, which I've had several. For your listeners that don't know, I do get occasional visits here at my house. When I first moved in, it was kind of off the chain. I had a lot of crazy things going on. I had trees broken. I had eye shine. I had something growling at my son almost nightly. It would just kind of be at his window or at the back door growling at him. And in fact, he got so used to it that he would just get to the point where he would ignore it and just roll over and go back to sleep. So it was ongoing for quite a while. And actually until they renovated the house that I live in, because I live in a duplex, that's when, activity kind of died down because there was people here all the time. But for that reason, that was something that Rick was very interested in. And he also has dogmen on his property in Wisconsin, and he's kind of run a few experiments by them to see how they react. So he decided to come down, and we decided to see for sure if he and I could actually do field research together. So he came down on a Friday night, and we talked about all the different areas that I had been to, or somebody in my family had been to where they had had a clear sighting or some sort of encounter. And so Saturday morning, we got up and we visited my ex-in-law's property. We didn't actually go on, but we drove by so I could show him where I had taken a picture of a dogman, which I have sent to you before in the past, and I can resend if you need. And this is a individual red in color that's standing next to a tractor. And so I pointed that area out to him. And he asked me if there was a back way in because their land touches up on like several acres of just woods. And I told him that I wasn't sure if there was, and that we decided that we would look at that once we got back to my house on Google Earth to see if there was a back way into that property. And then I also took him to the high school that my son had his Dogman encounter at, where there was a student a few years ago that got hit by a rock that was thrown from the creek bed, cleared telephone wires. We're guessing it was probably 100 feet. So whatever threw this thing, it actually hit the student in the head and it knocked him out cold. Whatever it was had a great arm, unfortunately, for this kid. But, we were looking at that and just kind of measuring the distance and trying to figure out exactly where on the hill across the creek this thing would have had to stand in order to even throw a rock. So we checked that area out, and my son's encounter, just very briefly, was about 2 years ago when he was a junior, and he'd been on the wrestling team. It was dark outside, and they were running laps around the football field, which is completely dark at night, except for, like, the floodlights. And the neighboring land all around them is just farmland. That's all it is. There's nothing else out there. I mean, cornfields across the street. I think they harvest hay in the barnyard that's next door, but he happened to look over because he saw something in his peripheral vision, and when he looked, he described what looked like a werewolf to him, running on all fours, very big and black. He said you could very easily see the snout, you could see the ears, but he said the odd thing was that it was chasing a car. So somebody was driving their car through the field, and this thing was chasing it. And he was more disturbed by the fact that there was a car in the field than the fact that there was a dogman. It was almost like he kind of fixated on that. He was a very logical person, so he was also kind of upset that he had seen it, because he'd heard my stories. And so he was kind of upset as if, it was my fault that he saw a dogman. But we went there, we took a look around, and I pointed out the area that my son described. And then after that, we came back to my end of town, and we went to a city park that I've mentioned in previous episodes that is about 3 miles from my house. In the last episode that I was in, that I talked to you about, I'd been down there in April with another research partner who's known as the man from Texas. And when we went there, it was during the time that somebody had recently gone missing, and I don't know or proclaim to know if there's any way that it's connected to any of the things that we found. But we did find some very strange things, and this individual, as far as I know, was never found. The body was never recovered. Nobody knows what happened to him, but we ended up stumbling across, back in the spring, like a pretty freshly abandoned campsite that had very expensive camping equipment, from the tent to very nice socks to very nice sleeping bags. Well, it's still there. When we went a month ago, it was still there. It's kind of been beaten down by weather, but everything is still in place. Nothing has been touched, which is kind of odd. It's about 25 feet from the bike path. And it's still there. So we took a look around there for a little bit, and we talked about it, and then we started to go into the riverbeds where the man from Texas and I had been in the spring, and where we had found some good-sized Sasquatch and Dogman prints together. And we stopped in that area, and there was nothing new, and it wasn't nearly as wet because it's a different season. But Rick and I decided to go deeper in, which is what I wanted to do because I knew that there was a pond back there. So we went deeper into the river bottoms, and we ended up in an area that I can really kind of only describe as sort of a marshy area, just very tall grass, lots of water, very swamp-like, more or less. And we came across some tracks and took a look at them, and we were both very confident that they were, in fact, Dogman tracks. They measured about 5 by 4, so 5 inches long and 4 inches wide. Some of them were about 7 inches long and 5 inches wide, some very clear tracks. And so we took our time measuring, kind of looking at things and talking about what we were looking at. And then off to our right in the marshy kind of swamp-like area, we could hear something really big moving and kind of crashing through the trees. And Rick had a bionic ear, and we both started to listen, and all we could really hear was just something pretty big moving parallel to us. That could have been anything. Could have been deer. Could have been anything, really. So we didn't get too excited about that. But a little bit further in on the left side, something started to growl at us. And whatever it was pretty low growl, and we couldn't see anything, so whatever it was very well hidden in the tall grass. Definitely had the creepy feeling of being watched, that everybody describes that with this phenomenon. And the sun was starting to set, so we didn't stay too far in because it was late afternoon. And we had decided that we wanted to do a night expedition. So we kind of wrapped everything up, but we decided to go check out one other end of Shelby Park, which is where we were, that runs into my neighborhood that I didn't even know about. So it was a second entrance that's only 2 miles from my house. And I was just kind of floored. For me, it was great because it was almost like puzzle solving finally, because I do, even now, I still get occasional visits. I don't have activity like I did when I first moved in here, but I will get the occasional visit, and that usually pertains to waking up in the middle of the night and hearing something walking around on my roof. So when we found this entrance, I was just floored at how close it was. And because it was getting dark and everything, we didn't have a whole lot of time, so we just kind of went to the trailhead, and right on the trailhead, we found a very large piece of scat, and we measured it, and it was about 2 inches across, so I'm not really sure how many inches in diameter, but 2 inches across, and it was 18 inches in length, so this thing was huge. Had hair in it. I actually have a sample of it sitting in my freezer. And if any of your listeners happen to know a reliable source that I can send it to get it analyzed, that would be great. And we can talk about how to contact me later. But we didn't take a sample that day. We just went ahead and took pictures and decided to go back to my house and rest and get ready to do a night expedition. And so while we were kind of sitting and unwinding, Rick contacted a friend of his that is, I believe, a wildlife biologist who has worked exclusively with timber wolves, and he sent the photos to him. I don't believe this individual is involved with Dogman research, but he came back and told Rick that whatever it was too big to be a wolf, and it was too big to be a coyote, and it was too big to be a dog. But whatever it was a very big individual, and that it was not the alpha, because there is so much hair in the scat. It meant that whatever this individual is had slim pickings compared to what the alpha would have. And that if that's the case, that would also mean that the alpha is much larger than this individual who left us behind. So that was very fascinating. So we kind of rested, and Saturday night about 10:30, we left. Oh, and by that point, Rick had Google Earthed the area where my ex-in-laws lived, and we found another park, which I had known about, but I'd never realized that it actually backed up to their property. So we found another park that's basically on top of a small mountain, more or less, which is kind of the hills that I can actually see from their property, and is actually it's in a small town actually just outside of North Nashville. And so we decided that we were going to go ahead and go investigate. And I told them I wasn't confident that the gate would even be open, because most of the parks around here are shut at sunset. But it was open, and so we ended up going up this hill, and he was getting really excited because it was densely wooded. And we ended up at the top, and there's a parking area, and we sort of circled the parking lot, and we decided to stop. And we decided that we were going to run an experiment that he has also run in his home state. And it's not a call that I'm going to disclose because after much discussion with Rick, our concern is that if we air it, that people may try to use this and that, there's the risk of people getting themselves into a dangerous situation with one of these things. But all I can say is that it was certain canine sounds. But we ended up call blasting with a Bluetooth speaker, and we did it 2 times, and then we got the bionic ear out and we sat and waited, and pretty much instantaneously, in front of us at about 25 feet, I started to see things. And the first thing I noticed was that there was an individual that was commando crawling or belly crawling from the right side of the wood line across the road and moving very fast in that position. I mean, quite honestly, almost where I wasn't sure if I was actually seeing it. But it was belly crawling, and it looked at the car, and it kind of scooted across the street or the road. And then it kind of scooted back to the other side where it had come from. And then there was a second individual that I got a much better look at, and this one was standing upright in like a grove of trees. And it was darting his head out, very erratic movement. You could see the snout, you could see the ears, and you could see red eyes. And this one was very dark. So there's partial moonlight. There's no street lamps, nothing up there. So this is under partial moonlight, and it looked like the eyes were squinted, but they were kind of almost almond in shape. But you and I have actually talked about this in the past with type 3s, but this didn't look like a type 3. You could actually see the snout on it. It was very canine. And in fact, the ears were very canine, kind of darting his head out, looking around and kind of darting back, almost like it wanted to come out, but it wasn't sure, if that was a good idea. So it seemed almost agitated or excited in its movements. And we had the bionic ear on, and we could also hear howling in the distance. So we heard what sounded like coyotes and just what sounded like wolf howls. Rick is pretty positive that he heard a few individuals to the south of us moving around. I very strongly felt like something was standing behind the car, or at least observing the car, like to the point where it was almost maddening. You just had that very intense feeling of being watched. And on the bionic ear, down the ridge from where I was sitting, it was just sort of an angle that just ran straight down a deep ridge. We could hear something walking bipedally, but we also were hearing mumbles. We were hearing grunts. We were hearing growls. And some of the vocals, to me, they sounded very human-like. And I'm pretty sure, probably in the past with some of the other encounters and things I've experienced, I've probably have heard these before. But I just instantly assumed it was a Sasquatch. And so we're listening, and I looked at him, and I said, "Squatch." And he shook his head at me, and he said, "No, that's a Dogman." And so I said, "Okay." And I'm looking at these two out the windshield, and once he told me that, I started to feel pretty anxious. So, my heart starts beating, pounding in my chest, and I'm getting a dry throat, and I'm starting to get kind of scared. And in my mind, part of me is just going, we got to go. We got to get out of here right now, because this is bad. This could really, really turn bad in a minute. And then there was the other part of me that was trying to be kind of logical, because we're doing research. And I'm sort of struggling with both of these. And there's another part of me that's like, okay, just calm down. It's okay. Let's just see what happens. And kind of at that point, we start to hear the individual down the ridge from us stop walking. And then all of a sudden it just takes this fast beeline right up the ridge, like dead at us. And Rick looks at me and he says, "They're coming." And he has a big grin on his face. He's done this before. I haven't, And I just kind of took the earbud out of my ear, and I'm tensing up, and I'm just kind of lowering it, because by that point, you can hear it. My window was rolled up, but his was partially down, but you can hear something really big coming up the ridge at us. And he kind of looks over at me, and he said, "Do you want to go?" And I looked at him, and I said, "Yeah," just kind of like that, because I was feeling really kind of tense and afraid, but I was trying to just wait it out and see what happens. But as soon as I said that, he was very much a gentleman, and he said, okay, that's okay, we can go. And as soon as he turned the car on, whatever was running up at us stopped. So like as soon as the engine came on, it just stopped. I looked in, the passenger side mirror, couldn't see anything, but definitely could sense it, and like very strongly could sense something there. And looked behind us, and I didn't see anything. And in fact, it looked like the two that were in front of us had just sort of, either they were standing still or they just gotten out of there as soon as the car started. And so we ended up driving down the hill and getting out of there, and he was really excited. Like, he was just ecstatic about his experiment working, but just that, there was activity there. And I'm just running things through my mind because this is an area, I'm not the park part of it, but this is a generalized area where I've had many encounters, only on the other side of the hill, as well as my family. My family also has seen things. So I was kind of running that scenario through my mind, but also just really still kind of shooken up, and like I said, there's still a certain degree, I think, for me, of PTSD. And at the same time, just really sort of, everything getting concrete. So this was just a whole night of that with everything that we did. So I was sort of excited by what happened, but I was also kind of scared by what happened and just really deeply fascinated. And just kind of amazed. And then we ended up leaving. We didn't even talk about the fact that we both had seen two individuals in front of the car. And I think if we brought it up at the time, it just really would have freaked me out more, I think. So we didn't even talk about that yet. But we ended up leaving the area. And then we drove to my son's old high school. When I was there, the last time I did a night investigation was with a man from Texas. And, it wasn't very intense, actually. I think that was the only place that we went to, if I recall, at night. But he and I, in April, the man from Texas and I, saw eye shine that we're both like 98% sure was a Sasquatch. I mean, even just the behavior, the tree peeking behavior. So we ended up going there, and we call blasted there, and we put on the bionic ear, and I think it was probably about 12:30 by this time. And we heard what sounded very much like the Ohio howl, very similar, and coyotes in the distance. And then we also heard something that sounded very similar to the Skookum howl answer the individual that sounded like the Ohio howl. And the one that was doing the Ohio howl sounded pretty mad. He or she was not happy. So we sat there and we kind of waited. And, as we had driven in fact, I had the thermal camera, and I did sweep across an individual that I could only see very briefly that was pretty good in size, saw some eye shine, and it quickly moved away. And the problem is it's inconclusive. It could have been anything at this point, and to include a deer, because it had a vantage point to us. This was up on a ridge. But as we were sitting there and we were listening on the bionic ear, we could hear something very big moving through the woods towards us. And it got to a point where it was kind of stopped, and then we just sort of heard this whoa noise, and then it kind of grunted once, and then we heard it move back off into the woods, like back into the direction it had come from. And so we both thought, okay, well, that's probably a squatch. And once it realized it was just people making these noises, it wasn't very interested. So that was interesting that we were able to call that in, but then we ended up leaving after that, and we decided to go to my neighborhood park. And by the time we got there, it was about 1:30 in the morning. And that was really fascinating. So this, again, like I said, all these parks were supposed to be shut down during the night, but when we got there, there were a few people they were in like the baseball diamond behind us. So there was a parking lot that was there, and there was just a few people in their cars there, coming and going. Where I normally go and park here in this area, there's a railroad bridge. And so the parking lot kind of backs up to railroad trestles. And then there's a path that leads in. So we parked and we played the same vocalizations. We had the bionic ear on. And it was, I swear it was like Jurassic Park. It just all kinds of noise. So we had normal nature sounds. There are red wolves here. Definitely heard some very beautiful wolf calls. Heard coyote calls. Heard what sounded like coyote calls or something imitating coyote calls. got very, very low octave wolf calls. We got growled at. We definitely heard what sounded like squatch howls too. Got roared at. There's something in the distance just let out this real angry roar that we were just picking up. You know, and it's hard to say if it was directed at us or not, or if we were just picking up on all of the activity in this area. But we also heard what sounded like human-like chatter. And the problem with that is because we were using a bionic ear, it's just hard to know if it was actually the people that were in the park behind us or if we were picking up sounds in the neighborhood. I don't know. But we definitely heard what sounded like human-like conversation going back and forth. There were a few times that we heard a train whistle, and we would hear it on the left and we would hear it on the right, as if, you know, like a train was coming in. And trains come in frequently where I live. So every time that happened, we would just take the earbuds out because we didn't want to bust our eardrums. But no trains came through. And I think this happened, I want to say this happened about 3 or 4 times while we were there. So that was very fascinating because you could hear these phantom train whistles and no train came through. So in the midst of this going on and listening, Rick had the thermal camera and he swept across a large individual that he said that he thought was probably about 10 feet, got eye shine, and he's positive that it was a dogman that he swept across. But he said as soon as the camera swept across its face, it just retracted back into the tree line. From my vantage point, I was looking at a trussel. My line of sight was lined up with this trussel that was probably, 20 feet from the car. And there was one individual that I could see pretty well, except the details of the face weren't all that great. So it was like right outside of the line of any light because there are some street lights there. So it almost just kind of stayed, obviously these things have been known to do this, it just stayed like right outside of the line of light, but there was enough light reflected so that you could see it. And all that I could see was a tall brown individual with red eyes, and it was pacing back and forth. So it was pacing from like one vantage point, it would just go to the other, and it was just watching us. And it looked like there were 2 others that were kind of crouched down into the tall grass, but all I could really see was just sort of eye shine and just sort of the shape of something there. And so we stayed there for a while until I only live up the street, and I had to go to the bathroom pretty bad. We'd been out for hours, and so we decided to wrap it up and just go back to my house. So we came back to my house, and we got comfortable, and I went out into the living room, and I looked at Rick, and I said, okay, we're doing it here. So we're going to call blast here because I want to see if we can call in when it comes to visit. And he was all for it. And by that time, it was about 3:30 in the morning. And so we got everything set up on my front porch. And I'm pretty sure it really, you know, if the neighbors caught any of it, I don't know. But there were a few people that were still had lights on. But we got everything set up on the front porch, and we went ahead and we call blasted. And I'm telling you, man, as soon as we call blasted, to our right from across the road where there is a very deep part of the canal that's really wide and a huge drainage pipe, guessing it came from that area, maybe 30 feet from my front door. We heard a whoop, and then we heard hyena-like laughter, which was extremely eerie. And I think my eyes probably popped out of my head, and I just looked at him. I looked at Rick, and he just kind of nodded like, yep. And then he said, now what we're going to do, because we're in a neighborhood, is we're going to listen. We're going to see what the dogs do. And so one dog, like a couple of streets over, started to bark. And he said, now, if there's a dog that barks closer to us, then that's how you know that they're coming in. And so we just kind of stood there quietly, and we waited, and a few minutes later, a dog closer to us started to bark. And he said, oh, yeah, they're coming in. And I said, okay. And then things kind of got quiet, and we call blasted again. And sure enough, you know, dogs were barking. And directly across the street from where I was standing, there's a ranch-style house with a fence. And at one point, I saw something kind of raise its head. We got very bright white eye shine. And whatever this individual was, it was looking directly at me, and I was looking directly at it. And it kind of looked at Rick for a minute and looked at me and kind of sort of looked over its shoulder and then just kind of sunk its head back down. And this happened just within a matter of seconds. You know, it just seemed to kind of happen pretty fast. You know, and I was trying to get Rick's attention, and I think he saw it with me. I'm not sure. But then, oh man, I want to say maybe a few minutes later, we heard something moving like it was on a mission. It was moving through the drainage system, which is really wide because we're so close to the river. So it was like this conduit that's underneath the street, and it's galvanized metal. And we heard it walking through, and it ended up in my backyard because the canal is actually part of my property. And it started walking through with ease. And I mean, it's rocky back there. This thing was moving with ease, just over everything. Definitely sounded like it was on 2 feet. And it came to the dark part of the house where I've had a lot of activity in the past. And Rick went straight over there, and he just said, "Hey," and this thing stopped. And I'm by the door, and I'm whispering at him. I'm like, "What, are you crazy? What are you talking to it for?" No. And he just turned around and looked at me, and he just motioned to go back in the house. So we picked everything up, and we went into my house, and we were very quiet, and we were listening at the same time, but we got my front window open, and we set up the Bluetooth speaker and the bionic ear so that we didn't have to use earbuds, and we just sat. And by this time, it was like 4 a.m, and we're listening to cars go by, and we're just listening, and we're whispering to each other. And I want to say maybe 15 minutes in, we heard something growl from my front yard. Very low, intentional growl. Like it was aware that we were there. And it was a very familiar growl. I've heard it plenty of times here. And it's something my children have heard. My son heard many times, especially. And I just looked at him, and Rick's eyes just went wide, and just the look on his face of, oh my God. And I was just like, yep. And then we just kind of got quiet again for a little while. And we hadn't eaten in a while, and he'd asked me if it was okay to get something to eat, and I offered to get him something. So I walked into the kitchen, and right on the other side of the wall outside, I guess whatever was out there had heard me because it growled a second time. And I brought it to his attention. I was like, oh, yeah, it's still here. It just growled at me. And I think at first he thought I was kidding until he saw the look on my face, and he was like, oh. And I was like, yeah. I said, whoever that is or whatever that is, it's come here plenty of times. It's the same tone. Everything's the same. And so we kind of settled back down and listened for a while, and there didn't seem to be anything else. So we wrapped everything up by like 4:30, and we decided that we were going to get some rest, but that we were going to go back out Sunday morning because we wanted to go back to Shelby Park. We wanted to get a sample of the scat that we found. And we also saw some interesting areas that we wanted to check out. But when we got up the next morning, I told him we were going back to Area 1, where we had the really intense charge and where we saw the 2 individuals. I was like, no, we're going back. And he was like, great, we'll do that, but let's go towards sunset because I want to call blast again and see if we can possibly have them come in, you know, see if they'll respond. And I was all for it, but I was jumpy, you know, I was kind of jumpy. I mean, we went to the park and things here and there just kind of made me jumpy, but I had to realize that for myself, the intensity of everything that happened, it was okay for me to process it, and it was okay for me to be jumpy. But I was also kind of excited that we had a reaction, especially because he came down all the way from Wisconsin. It would have been really disappointing if nothing had happened, you know, if we hadn't even found a print. But we had a lot of things happen and go on. And I was also really trying to wrap my head around the fact that the mystery for me was solved as to how these things were getting in at night and getting into my yard. Because I had always thought that they were coming from the other side of the canal. And I actually went in there the next morning and I looked around, and the way that I thought they originally were coming in was through a very big concrete pipe, which is, I very easily could fit into it. I mean, I'm only 5'1", like I said, very easily fit into this thing. And the back end was open, which is interesting. So I've never seen it open before. So it's making me wonder if whatever came in, early Saturday or Sunday morning, when we were out there, may have exited that way. So that was pretty fascinating to see because that was new. So I explored in there a little bit and then came back out. And like I said, it solved a mystery for me, meaning there's a way into that park and out of that park that is extremely close to my house, which, again, I had not known. And that whatever it was that was coming through came in with an intent, like it'd been there, back there, hundreds of times. And it knew it very well. You could just tell it knew it very well. So that mystery was solved. That was great. And at the same time, it was a little disturbing knowing, having that confirmation and just knowing that these things, can just come in on a whim. Especially because, I'm literally 10 minutes from Nissan Stadium where the Tennessee Titans play, which is just mind-boggling. And Nashville has 640,000 people. So when people make the assumption, no matter where they are, oh, I'm safe, they're not going to come here, I don't mean to sound like the bearer of doom. I'm not trying to. But this is not something that can be underestimated in that sense, and I don't think it should be. I don't think people should be complacent. But I also don't think that people need to be paranoid and worried. We still have to continue with our lives. But in this case, I don't think you can never say never, in a way. That's just something that I learned from this experience. So anyway, we got up, we went back to the park, and we collected a sample of scat. And we ended up looking around. We were kind of exploring things by the pond, shot some pictures of the area. We also followed some of the trails. And yeah, I was a little jumpy. Like I'd hear something or I'd see something and just, I was a little bit jumpy that morning, but it was all right. And found a very interesting teepee formation. I mean, this is one of the photos that I will be sending to you. There is something at the bottom of it that looks almost like a canine face, and it could just be a trick of light. I don't know, but that was interesting. I mean, we didn't spend a whole lot of time there. We just wanted to kind of explore some areas that I'd never been into before. And from there, we left and went back to Area 1. And when we went to Area 1, and this may be unrelated, but with this field, there seems to be other strange things that go on that I'm sure people have talked about, but some of it's human in nature. I can't really explain it. I don't know. But we ended up going to Area 1, and it was kind of busy. There were people that were up there hiking, and we were in the parking lot where we had been, and we got out of the car instantly. And the first place that both of us had gone to, because we talked about it, finally, once we got home, we talked about Area 1, and we talked about the fact that we both had seen some dogmen in front of us. Rick saw the one that was commando crawling. Rick did not see, because of the angle of where he was sitting, he could not see the individual that was in the trees. So we both got out. We started walking around, and I actually did take video of the area. And he went straight to the area where we both saw the one that was commando crawling. And I just went to the grove of trees and looked around, but given leaves and given just hard-packed earth, there really wasn't anything too decisive that was left behind. So, but when we were doing this, we had an individual approach us and ask us if we were looking for the trailhead. And, we said no, very politely said no, and just kind of went about our business. But he was very suspicious of us, and it was just kind of weird. So we kind of took a look around, and after that was done, I just took a beeline for the back area of where we had been the night before, because I was so sure that something was behind the car. It just really, really felt, and I've had that feeling before in relation to these things and other things when they have been there. I've had the very intense feeling of being watched and very intense feeling of them being in close proximity. So I just went there, and he, Rick came with me and was following me, and I was like, I got to see if there's anything over here, because I swear something was standing behind the car. And so we found the incline, and we went down, and we started to walk, and Rick stopped me, and he was like, wait. And I said, what? And he looked, and you could see this disturbance in the leaf litter, right? So there was like one area that had sort of been kicked up and then another area that had been kicked up, and it was leading up the incline to the parking lot. And he was like, just wait. And he got real excited and he started to just kind of take his time digging through the leaves very carefully and looking. And he started with like one spot. And then while he was doing that, I was measuring the distance between steps. And I believe it was about 6 feet between steps. Okay. It was, or 5 or 6 feet. It was a very healthy distance as far as I know. And then he found one area that he cleared away, and underneath of it, sure enough, there was a print. Now, this print measured 11 by 7. So it was 11 inches in length, and it was 7 inches in width. And there was detail that you could see. I mean, it wasn't great detail, but there was detail that you could see looking at it. You could see a heel. You could see where toes fanned out, and you could see claws, okay? And I took a picture of this thing, and unfortunately, it's like the camera doesn't pick it up. And so again, when you and I spoke yesterday, I told you that it's not a photo that you could easily share with anybody else because they're probably not going to see it, unfortunately. And I think you'd have to have an incredibly good camera and not a cell phone to take pictures to see if any of the details came out, but it was really impressive. And so I looked at Rick and I said, okay, in all of your travels and all of your experience, have you seen a print this size? And he was like, nope. He said, I've only seen photos of them. And it was really healthy in size. And so it just made us realize that this was the individual that came charging up the hill after us. And, you know, it was like, wow. I mean, and it was big, very big individual. And we started to talk about somebody that we've been working with, and I've actually talked to quite extensively, who's in the Four Corners area, he had an encounter, I think about 20 years ago, and it was him and his uncle, and they'd been traveling back from some area and pulled off to rest for a few hours. And they had an encounter with an individual that climbed onto the car, on top of the roof of the car, and it swung its feet over. And he said that the pads on this thing and the size of these feet were just phenomenally large. And so for me, that was very exciting because I'd never seen a print quite like that, except years and years and years ago on my ex-in-law's property, I saw a print that was shaped just like this one. Okay. Same shape, much better detail. And of course, I didn't really know what I was looking at back then, but it was much smaller than this. And that was the fascinating thing to me because that could, of course, mean because of the area that we're in, that it was the same individual who left a print behind years ago, or the same type. But it was still pretty fascinating and pretty exciting. And also kind of hair-raising at the same time to realize that it was a very, very big individual that was coming up the incline at us. So we took some photos. We started talking about some things, you know, brainstorming on just some similarities. Also, we discovered about 10 feet from where the car had been parked was a tree that was pushed over. And I'm sure that you know, Vic, and other people that are familiar with this field, it has been theorized, and I'm not sure if eyewitnesses have seen this or not, but the theory is that if there are trees that are pushed over and the root balls are up, the dogmen have sort of dug out like a little area underneath to rest. So 10 feet from the car, we find this. Okay. And there are leaves in it, and it was lined up from where I was sitting the night before. So that was pretty intriguing as well. But so anyway, we're there for a while and we're talking, and it's getting close to sunset. And so we get in the car and we're just kind of waiting at that point. And, you know, we started to even talk about the fact that we didn't do any recording. We didn't take pictures of anything. Even when we were having the sightings and we were listening to the vocals, you know, and I've had a few people since ask me, why didn't we record? Well, the whole point is, in some areas, dogmen are there, okay? And so if you want that kind of information, you can go and you can get it. And this wasn't really a fact-finding mission on collecting data to prove the existence, especially because you're dealing with two eyewitnesses that already know that they exist. So for us, it was a little bit different. I think the next time we actually research together, we may try to do that to present some of the data for people. But at the same time, this was more about seeing how well he and I work together, which is very important for us to find out if we're going to be doing things in the future, which we already have future plans. So close to sunset, the odd thing was the guy that had been there before, he had left the park, but he'd been very interested in what we were doing. And he came back and he parked near us. He was there for about 20 minutes, and it was making both of us kind of suspicious and uncomfortable, and then he left, right? So as soon as he left, there were still a few people that were in the park and on the trails. But we call blasted anyway because it was starting to get late, and, I had to be back to work early Monday, so there were other things I needed to take care of before settling in for the night. So we call blasted, and I stuck my phone out of the car door and just hit record just to see if we could pick anything up. And I'm positive that I could hear howls in the distance, and what they were for sure, I don't know. It's something, what I have to get analyzed still. I don't have the equipment to do that, but it needs to get analyzed to see if it actually was picking up any kind of howls. But the problem with it is it could be anything howling, any form of canine howling. Oh, and one interesting fact, or a couple of interesting facts that I'll get into in a minute once I finish up with this, is what we use to call blast also seems to have an effect on other canines. And I'll explain why in a few minutes. But after we call blasted and we did all of this, a police officer showed up, and he ended up driving around the parking lot and kind of parked behind us. And so we decided, okay, we need to go. And we weren't sure if somebody had heard what we were call blasting and had called the police or not, but we ended up leaving, and we were followed out of the park, and we were followed to the main highway, and then he kind of split off and went in his own direction. So that was kind of strange, but we're just not sure what that was. But sometimes when you research, there just seems to be these really strange coincidences of people in law enforcement showing up, and it may not have been anything, but it was an interesting coincidence. So we ended up going back to my house and settling in and uploading photos and talking to a lot of people about what we had experienced. And my son, who he's in the military now, he normally calls home like once a week, and so he happened to call, and I put him on speakerphone, and we were talking to him, and I asked him to tell me again about his encounter at the high school, and he didn't miss a beat, word for word. He said exactly what he had seen, and again had said that he was more disturbed by this car, because he said it seemed like the car was floating and just drifting through the field, and he said that bothered him. Again, that bothered him more than actually seeing a dogman. So we kind of wrapped that up. We talked about everything that we had experienced, and interestingly enough, we did find a coyote print in my yard the next day. It had been on my porch, or it had been really close to my porch. So we went outside, and by Sunday morning, at least in this part of town, it was just a little damp and muddy, but we're really close to the river. So it's almost like everything, like the whole environment's just different on this end of town. And there's a print, a canine print. It was a really good sized canine print, and I'm just staring at it, and I'm tired and everything, and it's been a really, very much an adrenaline-packed weekend. And I'm just staring at it, and I'm like, Rick, come here, look at this. And so he came over and looked at it, he said, oh, it's a coyote. And I was like, oh, okay. I said, well, yeah, we've got those all over the place. And we do. I've seen coyotes in this neighborhood. I've seen deer. I've had big deer just run straight through my yard. And red wolves. I've seen red wolves crossing the street here. But whatever it was that came in, or at least it definitely what was across the street watching, not any of those. But it does look like these call blasts that we used called in an inquisitive coyote. I don't think that's what was growling at us from the front yard, only because the octaves were so low, to the point where like some of the lower tones it was hitting were almost vibrational. But it was interesting. And up in Wisconsin, he'd experienced with some of these sounds with some of the working canines that he works with, and had responses from them as well that I really can't get into. But another thing that we noticed in Shelby Park, because there seems to be this one area that there's a lot of animal activity, and I'm not really sure why. But if it's muddied because of the water, you will find all kinds of prints. I mean, just all kinds, just deer, raccoons, small cats. We have small cats. We've got bobcat in lakes, I think. And wolves. We actually found a wolf print, which was a beautiful print. And I was excited because it's the first time that I'd ever seen a red wolf print here. But there was something else that left territorial scratches in this area where domestic dogs had crossed through because people bring their dogs down, and walk them, and where this wolf track was. And whatever it was left long scratches, and the span between claws was about 2 inches. It left these long drag marks, like it was marking its territory. And from end to end, between what looked like the front area where it was scratching and the back area was about 5 feet. So whatever this was a pretty healthy size. So that was interesting. Rick had taught me, because I didn't really think about it before, that sometimes when, like for instance, a dog will pee or poop in an area where other dogs have, right after they're done, they scratch. And I always thought that they were just burying it. I didn't know that that was not what they're doing. I guess, in fact, what they are doing is they're actually marking their territory, too, by leaving these scratch marks. So that was pretty fascinating. And I'm just trying to think right now off the top of my head if there's anything that I forgot to include about him being here and what we went through, but I think that's it. I can't really think of anything else. I think that pretty much covers everything that went on that weekend while he was here.
Just imagine what it would be like to live a dull life, Lisa.
Oh, that's so funny.
I'm not so sure you could. It never is a dull moment with you.
Are you kidding? I mean, I need a vacation very, very badly. I need a week or maybe longer of just absolute calm and relaxation. I haven't had that in a long time.
I don't know. I think it would take more than a spa day or two to help you unwind from this, but who knows? That's just my opinion.
Yeah.
It's about time for us to get out of here, but before we do that, how can eyewitnesses who want to share their encounters with you do that?
The best way to get in touch with me, you can look me up on Facebook. It's a very distinct profile. It's a drawing of the creature I saw at 5 years old. You can't miss it. But you can look for me, Lisa Lichen X. And my research page on Facebook is the acronym for Lisa. So it's Lisa Lichen International Sasquatch Association. We are open to other researchers. We are open to eyewitnesses. And we are definitely open to those that are curious about this subject. We just only ask that people be respectful towards each other because people have different views. Different views are more than welcome because we learn. And anybody who is having ongoing encounters with these things or trying to make sense of what's going on, please do contact me. And Rick and I from Wisconsin would be more than happy to help anybody that's looking for help.
Well, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Thanks so much for doing what you do. I'm so glad you help these people the way you do. Thanks, too, so much for your time coming back on the show to tell us about these new experiences. I really appreciate it.
Well, sure. I was happy to do it.
Well, thanks again so much for your time. Have a good night. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you.